He didn't knock. You don't knock when you're dragging death in behind you. The door just swung open on a gust of prairie wind, and he stumbled in, a ghost made of snow and blood. His chest was a mess, a canvas of crimson painted over torn buckskin. But it was what he held that made the air in Mabel's cabin turn to glass. A baby. Swaddled so tight against his failing body that its own life seemed tied to his. Mabel's hands, which had been reaching for the kettle, froze in midair. The hiss of the boiling water on the stove just vanished, swallowed by the sudden heavy silence he brought with him. It had been 5 years since she'd been this close to a Lakota man. 5 years since the raid that had stolen her husband, torched her barn, and left her with nothing but this crumbling homestead and the ghosts of everyone she'd ever loved. But this man wasn't here to raid. He was here to die. He collapsed in a heap on the floorboards, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate surrender. One arm stayed wrapped around the child, a final, desperate vow made of bone and sinew. He didn't make a sound. The baby, however, let out a tiny, rasping whimper. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was the sound of pure, raw hunger, and it shot up Mabel's spine like a lightning strike. Grief does strange things to a woman's body. It had been 2 winters since her own daughter, Ruthie, had gone cold in her cradle. 2 winters since she'd felt the pull of a hungry child. She thought that part of her had dried up and blown away with the dust. But as she looked at this tiny, frantic life, something ancient stirred inside her. A fierce, forgotten instinct. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was hope. At this point, she couldn't tell the difference. She moved without thinking, scooping the child from the dying man's arms. The baby's weight settled against her, fitting into a hollow in her soul she thought would never be filled again. She unbuttoned her dress, her fingers clumsy but sure. When the baby latched on, a gasp tore from her throat. It was a jolt of pain and warmth, a flood of life rushing back into the broken places she had long since abandoned. The man on the floor stirred, his eyes, dark and feverish, cracked open. He wasn't looking at her with anger or fear. It was a haunted stare, the look of a man who had chosen the exact spot where he would fall and was praying to whatever gods were left that it would matter. Mabel said nothing. She just met his gaze, her expression hard as iron, while the child suckled greedily, a tiny, fierce life in the middle of a world of death. "You brought death to my door," she finally muttered, her voice low and dangerous. "You better pray I don't decide to finish the job." He didn't flinch. He didn't have the strength. Instead, he raised a single, trembling hand. Not toward her, not toward the child, but just into the air, as if trying to touch the moment itself. He was reminding himself it was real. The man was dying, that much was clear. But as she stared down at him, she noticed something that sent a fresh chill through her. The gash across his ribs was deep, bleeding sluggishly onto her floorboards. But the sheer volume of blood soaking his shirt. It wasn't right. It was too much. Far too much for a single wound. Most of the blood on his shirt wasn't his. And that's when everything changed. Because if he was covered in someone else's blood, it meant he hadn't come from a simple accident. He'd come from a slaughter. The wind howled outside, throwing fists of snow against the thin glass of the windows. But inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. By morning, she knew 3 things. The baby's name was Tali, whispered from the man's cracked lips in a moment of fevered delirium. The blood on the shirt was, as she suspected, not his own, and he understood every single word of English she said. He hadn't spoken another coherent word, though. Not one. He just watched. When she'd fetched her sewing kit to stitch the gash on his ribs, he had moved with a sudden, surprising strength, pulling the baby a few inches further away from her needle. It wasn't a gesture of distrust. It was protective, ceremonial. Mabel didn't ask questions. She'd lived on the prairie long enough to know some secrets were best left buried. Men bled for all sorts of reasons, most of them involving sins they'd never speak aloud. Still, a dangerous curiosity was flickering to life inside her, a fire she couldn't quite stamp out. She boiled willow bark for his fever and yarrow for the angry swelling around the stitches. She fed the fire, stacking the kindling high, casting anxious glances at the door. Whatever had chased him here, whatever had spilled that ocean of blood onto his shirt, it wouldn't just give up. It was out there, somewhere in the blizzard, hunting. The child, Tali, had cried through the night. Not from pain, but from a grief too deep for his tiny body to contain. Short, sharp wails between desperate gulps of milk that echoed the ache in Mabel's own chest, a phantom pain she thought she'd buried with Ruthie. At one point, she caught herself humming. An old lullaby her mother used to sing, a sad, simple tune for lonely nights. The man's eyes had flicked toward her, and for a second, she saw something other than pain in them. Recognition, like the sound meant something to him, a memory from a world that had been burned down. She found herself wondering who had died out there in the snow, the baby's mother, his wife, or had he been the one holding the knife? The shirt he wore was another puzzle. It was made of thick, durable fabric, the kind issued to soldiers or lawmen. It was far too big for his lean frame, and it reeked of blood and gun smoke. As she carefully cut away the stiff, blood-soaked cloth near the hem to better clean his wound, her fingers brushed against something. Stitching. Neat, white thread, hidden on the inner hem. 3 letters. RJH. The initials meant nothing to her, but when she glanced up at the man, his jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles twitching in his cheek. His eyes were fixed on the scrap of fabric in her hand, and the look in them was pure, unadulterated fury. That shirt was a story, and it wasn't his. The man finally spoke as she was folding a clean blanket to place over the sleeping Tali. His voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves skittering across stone. "He was already dead," he rasped, staring at the fire. "I didn't kill him." Mabel didn't turn around. She just stood there, her back to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of the initials. She thought of the blood. She thought of the baby in the cradle. "You better hope that child outlives whatever followed you here," she said, her voice colder than the wind outside, "because I will not let him be an orphan twice." She waited until his fever broke. 2 full days of him drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering words in a language she didn't understand. 2 days of her sitting by the fire, the Spencer rifle across her lap, watching the snow pile up against the door and wondering when the ghosts he'd brought with him would come knocking. On the 3rd morning, he was sitting up. The fire had returned to his eyes, a guarded, watchful intelligence. He was cradling Tali, holding the baby with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the raw violence of his arrival. Mabel walked over and dropped the bloodied shirt onto the small table between them. The stiff fabric landed with a heavy thud. "You want to tell me?" she said, her voice flat and even. "Why a Lakota man is wearing a U.S. Marshal's shirt?" She expected a denial, a lie, maybe even a threat. She got none of them. He just pulled the child a little closer, his gaze fixed on the window, on the endless, silent white of the plains. He seemed to be looking for an escape he knew he wouldn't find. Then, he did something she never expected. He reached into a hidden fold of his own buckskin trousers, the ones he wore beneath the marshal's bloody shirt. His fingers emerged with something small and metallic. He placed it on the table next to the shirt, a silver badge, dulled with soot and bent at one corner as if it had taken a bullet. A U.S. Marshal's star. "He was my friend," the man said, his voice still rough. "His name was Reuben Hall. He saved my life 3 winters ago." Reuben Hall. The name hit Mabel like a physical blow. RJH, Reuben James Hall. 10 years. It had been 10 years since she'd seen him. 10 years since he'd ridden west, chasing a rigid black-and-white version of justice, while she stayed behind, trying to find peace in a world of gray. They were supposed to be married. "I found him outside Wounded Elk Ridge," the man continued, his voice a low monotone. "Shot through. Crawling for his horse. He pushed the child into my arms, said the mother was gone. Then he bled out." Mabel couldn't breathe. She stared at the badge, the tarnished silver a testament to a life spent chasing monsters. She remembered Reuben, so full of fire and conviction, the kind of man who made enemies just by walking into a room. "Why?" she whispered, the question a puff of steam in the cold air. "Why bring the child here? To me?" The man finally looked at her, and for the first time since he'd crashed through her door, she saw past the pain and the exhaustion. She saw grief, a raw, gaping wound that mirrored her own. "He said your name," the man said softly. "Mabel Crane. It was one of the last things he said. If anything happens, take the boy to Mabel. She'll understand." Her chest felt like it was encased in ice. The baby, Reuben's son, was sleeping peacefully in the arms of a stranger, in her cabin, 100 miles from anywhere. Fate hadn't just knocked on her door. It had kicked it down. "You knew Reuben," she stated, not a question. He nodded slowly. "He called me Red Hawk. Said I didn't deserve the name, but I wore it anyway." She reached out, her fingers trembling, and closed her hand around the bent badge. It was cold, so cold. "Then I guess," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "this child has 2 ghosts watching over him now." Red Hawk said nothing, but as the baby stirred, he shifted his arms, adjusting the blankets, with an expertise that spoke of long practice. He was already carrying the weight of someone else's future. He just didn't know that Mabel was starting to feel the same way. But as she looked at him, at the careful way he held the child, a new, unsettling thought began to form. His story was clean. Too clean. Men who found their friends murdered in the wilderness didn't just happen to ride for 2 days in a blizzard to a specific, isolated homestead. They ran. Unless they weren't just delivering a child. Unless they were running from something else entirely. The silence that followed the blizzard was wrong. It was too deep, too heavy. The world outside the cabin seemed to be holding its breath. Mabel stood on the porch, her father's old Spencer rifle clutched in her hands, its familiar weight a small comfort. Her eyes swept the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any shadow that was out of place. Behind her, Red Hawk stood like a statue, Tali bundled securely against his chest. They didn't need to speak. They both felt it. Someone was out there. She'd seen the signs at dawn. A broken branch on the trail from Wounded Elk Ridge, snapped too clean for the wind. Fresh hoof prints near the creek, from a shod horse, not a wild one. And a single, dark thread caught on a thorny bush. It wasn't wool or cotton. It was a strand of silk, the kind of fancy vest a gambler or a rich man might wear, not something you'd see on a common drifter. Whoever had been out there wasn't just a hunter. They were wealthy, and they were clumsy. How many people knew Reuben was traveling with a child? She asked, her voice low, not wanting the sound to carry. Red Hawk shifted the baby on his chest. None that should have mattered. But Reuben, he didn't just enforce the law, he made judgments. He angered powerful men. Mabel remembered that part of him all too well. Reuben saw the world in black and white, good and evil, and he was never shy about telling a man which side he was on, a dangerous quality in a land where fortunes were built on crime and secrets. She studied Red Hawk's face. The lines of exhaustion were etched deep, but there was something else there now, a coiled tension behind his jaw, a predatory stillness in his eyes. He hadn't slept. He'd been watching the door all night. "If they come," she said, turning to face him, "do I trust you to fight beside me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the sleeping baby, his expression unreadable. He adjusted the fur wrappings around Tali's face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Finally, he met her gaze. "Only if you promise not to stand in front of me." A ghost of a smile touched Mabel's lips. It was the first time in years. But her grip on the rifle didn't loosen. Trust was a seed that had been planted, but it was a long way from taking root. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The unspoken truce between them began to feel like something more, an alliance. After Tali was fed and asleep by the hearth, Mabel did something she hadn't done since before Ruthie died. She opened the small wooden chest where she kept her memories. She pulled out a small satchel of Reuben's letters, old, faded, the ink blurred in places by time and tears. She'd never had the heart to burn them. Red Hawk watched her from across the room. He saw her fingers tremble as she unfolded a brittle page, her eyes scanning the neat, confident handwriting that she knew as well as her own. "He wrote about a woman," Red Hawk said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "A woman who lived on the edge of the world. He said she could make a fire feel like a fortress." Mabel's throat tightened. She didn't reply, but she didn't put the letters away either. She left them on the table, a silent offering. A piece of her past laid bare. When she went to her small room to get a few hours of restless sleep, she left him there, sitting by the fire, the letters on the table, the sleeping child in the cradle beside him. In the deep, dark hours of the morning, with the storm pressing in on them from all sides, Red Hawk stayed awake. He wasn't just watching the door anymore. He was watching the letters, watching the child. And as he sat there, in the quiet warmth of a stranger's home, he felt the return of a feeling he thought he had lost forever. The feeling of being needed. He picked up one of the letters. His English was good, learned in mission schools he'd run from as a boy. He read Reuben's words, words of a future that never was, of a love for a woman named Mabel. Then he saw it. In a letter dated almost 10 years ago, Reuben wrote about his first assignment as a marshal. He wrote about a brutal murder, a rancher's family wiped out, and he wrote about the man he'd captured for the crime, a young Lakota warrior, fierce and silent, who swore his innocence even as they put the irons on him. A warrior whose name, Reuben wrote, was Wikasa Luda, Red Man. The man reading the letter felt the blood drain from his face. Reuben hadn't just called him Red Hawk. He had known his true name all along, and he had written it down. For her. Why? Why would Reuben tell her his real name, the name of a convicted killer, in a love letter? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore, unless Reuben wasn't his friend, unless this entire story was a lie. By the 5th day, a fragile peace had settled over the cabin. Tali had stopped his nightly grieving. He'd begun to gain weight, his cheeks rounding, his eyes losing their frantic edge. He would nestle into Mabel's chest as if he'd been born there, a perfect fit for the space her own daughter had left behind. Mabel found herself moving with a new purpose. Each task, from chopping wood to stirring a pot of stew, felt significant. She was no longer just surviving the days. She was building them. Red Hawk watched her constantly. His wounds were healing with a speed that was almost unnatural, but he never offered to help with the chores. He just sat and watched, and held the baby. He was a sentinel, a guardian of this strange, broken sanctuary. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of things they didn't know how to say. That night, after Tali was asleep, Mabel poured 2 cups of sassafras tea and sat across from him at the small table. The letters were gone, tucked back into their chest. "You haven't asked why I live out here alone," she said, breaking the quiet. He looked up, his gaze steady. "You don't strike me as a woman who needs permission to be left alone." A thin, crooked smile touched her lips. "I had a daughter, Ruthie." The name felt strange on her tongue, a ghost she hadn't summoned in years. She died 4 winters ago. A fever came in the night like a thief and left with everything. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just tightened his hands around his warm mug, as if it were an anchor in a storm. She appreciated his silence more than any platitude. "And you?" she asked, her voice soft. "You told me Reuben was your friend, but I read his letters. He wrote about you, Wakasa Luda. He said you were his prisoner." The air in the room crackled. The name, his true name, hung between them like a judgment. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight, his profile a mask of stone. She thought he would deny it, that he would lash out. Instead, he took a long, slow breath. "Both are true," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He arrested me. For a crime I did not commit, the murder of the Miller family." Mabel's heart went cold. The Miller ranch was 50 miles south. A wealthy man, his wife, and their children, all found slaughtered in their home 9 years ago. It was the talk of the territory for a year. They'd hanged a man for it. "They hanged you," she breathed. "They hanged someone," he corrected, his eyes dark with memory. "On the ride to the gallows, our transport was attacked. Not by my people, by white men. They weren't there to save me. They were there to kill me, to silence me. Reuben fought them off. He was wounded, but he got me away. In that ditch, bleeding beside him, he told me he believed me. He said the evidence never felt right. He said he was going to find the real killer." The story was insane. A U.S. Marshal faking a prisoner's escape to conduct his own secret investigation. It was exactly the kind of reckless, impossibly noble thing Reuben would do. "So for 9 years, I was his ghost," Wakasa finished. "His secret. I rode with him. I watched his back. We were hunting the man who framed me, the man who killed the Millers." He finally looked at her, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "We found him, but we were too late. He had already found Reuben." Mabel felt the floor shift beneath her feet. This wasn't just a story of a friend's death. This was a conspiracy, a 9-year hunt that had ended in blood and fire. "And the baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who is Tali?" Wakasa's expression shuddered. He looked down at his hands, at the scars on his knuckles. Reuben had found evidence. A witness, a woman who knew the truth. But the killer got to her first. Tali. Tali was her son. So Tali wasn't Reuben's child. He was the son of a murdered witness. Another layer of lies, another level of danger. This baby wasn't just an orphan. He was a loose end. The last living proof of a conspiracy that powerful men would kill to keep buried. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in Mabel's mind. The strand of silk thread on the bush. The expensive glove of a rich man. The Millers were wealthy. Their killer would be too. "This man," she said, her voice low, "the one who framed you. Who is he?" Before Wakasa could answer, a sound cut through the night. Not the wind, not a coyote, a horse's nicker, close, too close. Wakasa was on his feet in an instant, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was terrifying. He grabbed the rifle from the wall and moved to the window, peering through a tiny crack in the shutter. Mabel's blood ran cold. The peace was over. The hunters had found them. "How many?" she whispered, her own hand reaching for the heavy iron poker by the hearth. Wakasa didn't turn. "One rider," he said, his voice tight with confusion. "He's not hiding. He's riding straight for the door, and he's leading a second horse." This wasn't an attack. It was a visit. A sharp, confident knock echoed through the cabin, not the sound of a bounty hunter. It was the sound of authority. "Mabel Crane?" a voice called out, calm and clear. "Sheriff Brody from Weston Creek. I was just checking on my neighbors after the storm. Saw your smoke. Mind if I come in for a moment? It's colder than a banker's heart out here." Weston Creek was 30 miles away, too far for a casual ride in this weather. This was no social call. Mabel looked at Wicasa, whose eyes were wide with a dawning horror. He knew that name. Sheriff Brody. She unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The sheriff was a big man with a kind face and eyes that didn't smile when his mouth did. He was everything a lawman should be, and Mabel knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he was the most dangerous man she had ever met. "Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Bit of a ride from Weston Creek." He tipped his hat. "Worried about the folks out on the flats, especially a woman alone." His eyes flicked past her, into the dim light of the cabin. "You sure you're alone, ma'am? Could have sworn I saw 2 sets of tracks leading to your barn." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Just me and the ghosts, Sheriff. They get restless this time of year." He chuckled, a sound with no warmth in it. "I hear that." He paused, his gaze lingering on the empty cradle by the fire. "Heard a strange story in town, about our old friend Marshall Hall. Heard he might have been traveling with some precious cargo before his accident." The threat was veiled, but it was there. He knew. He knew about the baby. Wicasa stepped out from the shadows then, the rifle held loosely at his side. He didn't aim it. He didn't need to. His presence was a statement. Sheriff Brody's eyes widened in feigned surprise. "Well, now, look what the storm blew in. Red Hawk. It's been a long time. Last I heard you were swinging from a rope." "The rope broke," Wicasa said, his voice like gravel. The sheriff's smile finally faded. The mask was off. "Reuben always was a sentimental fool. Should have let you hang." He took a step back, his hand casually drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "The Miller fortune is a powerful thing, powerful enough to make a man do things he might regret, like leaving a witness alive, or a witness's bastard child." The truth hit Mabel with the force of a physical blow. The Miller fortune, the murdered family, Sheriff Brody, it was him. He was the killer. He was the one who had framed Wicasa all those years ago. "You," Mabel breathed, her knuckles white on the iron poker. Brody gave her a slow, lazy smile. "Me? Old man Miller was my uncle. He was never going to leave me a dime. A man's got to make his own way in this world." He looked at Wicasa. "Reuben figured it out. The fool. He should have just taken the bribe. Now, I've come for the boy. He's the last piece of the puzzle. Give him to me, and I'll let you both walk away." It was a lie. They all knew it was a lie. "There's a child in this house," Wicasa said, his voice low and deadly. "You want him, you come through me." Brody laughed, a real laugh this time, loud and cruel. "I don't think so." He raised his hand and gave a sharp, piercing whistle. From the trees behind him, 2 more figures emerged from the swirling snow. They weren't lawmen. They were hard-faced men with rifles, the kind who did other people's dirty work for a handful of silver. They were the men who had been leaving tracks in the snow. They were completely surrounded. "You see," Brody said, his voice dripping with triumph. "Reuben wasn't the only one with friends." He gestured to the 2 riflemen. "Boys, the woman lives. We need her to make the adoption of the orphan look legal. As for the Indian, make it look like he resisted arrest." The world narrowed to the space of a heartbeat. The 2 riflemen raised their weapons. Wicasa tensed, ready to sell his life for a few more seconds of the baby's. Mabel gripped the poker, a useless piece of iron against 3 guns. It was over. Then, a sound came from inside the cabin, a small, sleepy cry. Tali was waking up, and something inside Mabel Crane snapped. She had lost 1 child to the cold indifference of the world. She would not lose another to the hot-blooded greed of men. She looked at Wicasa. He looked at her. In that single shared glance, a lifetime of grief and fear was burned away, replaced by a single terrifying resolve. "No," Mabel said, her voice ringing out in the frozen air, clear and strong as a bell. Brody frowned. "No? You will not have this child," she said, taking a step forward, the poker held not like a tool, but like a scepter. "This house is a sanctuary, and you have trespassed," Brody sneered. "And what are you going to do about it, old woman? Read me a Bible verse?" Mabel smiled. It was a terrible, beautiful thing. "No, Sheriff," she said softly. "I'm going to introduce you to my father." And with that, she stomped her foot down. Hard, 3 times. For a moment, nothing happened. Brody and his men exchanged confused glances. Then, from beneath the floorboards of the porch, came a series of loud, metallic clicks. Brody's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked down. He was standing on a newly replaced section of the porch, the wood slightly lighter than the rest. A trapdoor. Before he could react, the floor gave way beneath him. He vanished with a strangled cry, swallowed by the darkness below. One of his men, startled, took a step forward and was immediately caught in a brutal snare trap that shot out from the side of the cabin, yanking him off his feet and leaving him dangling upside down from a tree branch. The third man, panicked, fired a wild shot that splintered the doorframe. Wakasa didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, the Spencer rifle coming up smooth and fast. He fired once. The man crumpled into the snow without a sound. Silence. The entire violent exchange had taken less than 5 seconds. Mabel stood on the edge of the gaping hole in her porch, breathing heavily, the poker still clutched in her hand. Wakasa was already reloading, his eyes scanning the tree line for more threats. From the dark pit beneath the porch came a string of curses, followed by a groan of pain. Brody was alive, trapped, but alive. Wakasa looked at Mabel, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Your father?" he asked. "My father," Mabel confirmed, a grim satisfaction in her voice, "was a paranoid, half-mad ex-cavalry scout who believed the world was going to end every Tuesday. He spent 10 years turning this homestead into a fortress. That pit is 20 feet deep and lined with sharpened stakes he borrowed from an army fort." She nudged a loose stone with her boot, sending it clattering down into the darkness. "I don't think the sheriff will be resisting arrest." The man in the snare was struggling, trying to reach for his dropped pistol. Wakasa raised the rifle again. "No," Mabel said, putting a hand on his arm. "Let him hang. Let him think about his choices." Inside, Tali began to cry in earnest, his wails sharp and demanding. The sound cut through the tension, a reminder of what they had been fighting for. Wakasa finally lowered the rifle, the coiled readiness slowly leaving his body. He looked at her, at the fierce, unyielding woman standing before him, and saw her for the first time. Not as a grieving widow, not as a reluctant savior, but as a warrior in her own right. A protector. "You said Reuben told you to come here," she said, her voice softening. "That I would understand." She looked from the pit to the man in the snare, to the body in the snow. "I think I finally do. He didn't send you to me for sanctuary. He sent you to me for ammunition." But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Brody was trapped, but he wasn't a man who worked alone. His network, the one built on the Miller fortune, was vast. Help would come. And as Wakasa stared into the pit, at the snarling, trapped sheriff, he knew Brody had one last card to play. One last secret that could destroy them all. Brody was the killer, yes. He had framed Wakasa, but there was still one piece that didn't fit. The mother. Tali's mother. "Where is she?" Wakasa shouted down into the pit, his voice echoing in the cold air. "The boy's mother! What did you do with her?" A wheezing laugh came from the darkness. "The mother? Oh, she's alive. For now. I kept her as insurance." A cough, then a pained groan. "But my friends know where she is. If I don't walk out of here by sunrise, they have orders to finish the job. So you see, Red Hawk, you're still my prisoner. You just don't know it yet." They tied the second man, whose name they learned was Jed, to a chair in the kitchen. He was a low-level thug, nursing a broken ankle from the snare, and a newfound respect for homestead architecture. He'd talked quickly. Brody wasn't lying. The woman, Ilara, Tali's mother, was being held captive in a fortified mining camp deep in the Black Hills, a place called Devil's Gate. It was Brody's personal fortress, run by a dozen of his most loyal and most brutal men. The standing order was simple. If Brody didn't return or send word by dawn, Ilara was to be executed. It was an impossible situation, a checkmate. They couldn't kill Brody, and they couldn't let him go, and dawn was only a few hours away. "It's a 2-day ride," Wakasa said, pacing the small cabin like a caged wolf. The victory had turned to ash in his mouth. "We'll never make it." Mabel was silent. She was looking at the map Jed had drawn for them on a piece of scrap paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the line to Devil's Gate, her finger moving past the marked trail over the jagged peaks of the mountains. "You won't make it on the trail," she said quietly. Wakasa stopped pacing. "What are you talking about?" "My father," she said, tapping a specific point on the map, a narrow, treacherous-looking pass. "He used to tell me stories. Before the army, he trapped these mountains. He knew shortcuts, goat trails, paths that aren't on any map." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a dangerous light. "He said you could cut through Serpent's Tooth Pass and be on the other side of the range in 5 hours. If you didn't fall." Wakasa stared at the map. Serpent's Tooth. It was legendary. A place where the wind could peel a man from the rock and send him screaming into the abyss. It was considered impassable, a suicide run. "No one has used that pass in 50 years, he said. "Then they won't be watching it," she replied. A desperate, insane plan began to form in the quiet of the cabin. It was a long shot, a gamble against the rising sun. Mabel turned to Jed, the bound man in the chair. You're going to earn your life. You're going to ride to the nearest marshal's office in Deadwood. You're going to give them this." She scribbled a quick note, explaining the situation, implicating Brody, and detailing the location of Devil's Gate. "You tell them everything. You lead them there." Jed nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with fear. "They'll kill me." "They'll kill you if you don't," Wakasa said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The plan was set. Jed would ride for the law, buying them time with a frontal assault on the camp. While the main force of marshals was engaged, Wakasa and Mabel would go over the mountain. He would create a diversion. She, the unassuming woman they wouldn't expect, would find Ilara. But there was one problem. The baby. They couldn't take Tali on a mad dash through the mountains. Mabel looked at the sleeping child, her heart aching. For the second time in her life, she was going to have to leave a child behind, trusting fate to be kind. She wrote a long letter, explaining everything, and pinned it to Tali's blanket, next to Reuben's bent badge. She bundled him up, warm and secure, and looked at Jed. "There's a mission an hour south of here, the Sisters of Mercy. You take the child there first. You leave him on the doorstep. You do not fail in this. If anything happens to that boy," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "there is no hole deep enough for you to hide in." They left in the dead of night, Mabel on her sure-footed mule and Wakasa on Reuben's sturdy gelding. They left the body in the snow as a warning. They left Brody cursing in his pit. They rode not towards the war party Jed would bring, but towards the silent, jagged teeth of the mountains. The climb was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, a physical force trying to rip them from the narrow ledge. Below them, the world was a swirling vortex of snow and darkness. But Mabel's father had been a good teacher. She remembered his words, his warnings. Trust the animal, not your eyes. Feel the mountain. Don't fight it. They moved in silence, a desperate two-person army against an impossible foe. In the darkness, clinging to the side of a mountain, something shifted between them. They were no longer a homesteader and a fugitive. They were partners. Two broken souls, fighting for a chance at redemption, fueled by the hope of saving a woman they had never met and a child who had brought them together. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, they reached the summit. Below them, nestled in a dark valley, they could see it. Devil's Gate. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and in the distance, they heard the first faint sounds of gunfire. Jed had kept his word. The marshals had arrived. The battle for Devil's Gate had begun. "It's time," Wikasa said, his face grim in the gray light. He turned to Mabel, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. "Mabel, be careful." She just nodded, her own face set in a mask of determination. "You too. Don't get yourself killed. I'm not raising that boy alone." He allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. Then, with a cry that was half prayer, half war, he spurred his horse and charged down the mountainside, firing the Spencer rifle, a one-man diversion to draw the eyes of the camp towards the west, away from the north, away from the quiet woman on the mule who was picking her way down a hidden ravine. The battle was chaos. The marshals, led by Jed, were putting up a furious fight at the main gate. Wikasa, a phantom on the ridge, was picking off sentries, his shots echoing through the canyon, making his single rifle sound like a dozen. The camp was a hornet's nest, and Mabel walked right into the middle of it. No one paid any attention to the lone woman leading a mule. They saw her, but they didn't see her. In their minds, women were victims, not threats. They were cargo. They were prizes. She used that prejudice against them, her face a mask of fear and confusion as she stumbled through the camp, looking for the place they would hold a valuable prisoner. She found it. A small, reinforced cabin at the very back of the camp, with two guards at the door. They were distracted, their attention fixed on the firefight at the main gate. Mabel took a deep breath. She thought of Ruthie. She thought of Tali. She thought of the promise she'd made to a dying fire in her cabin. She pulled the heavy iron poker she had strapped to her saddle, a piece of home she couldn't leave behind, and walked towards the guards. "Please," she cried, her voice choked with fake sobs. "Help me! I'm lost!" The guards turned, annoyed. One of them opened his mouth to tell her to get lost. He never finished the sentence. Mabel's poker swung in a vicious, whistling arc, catching him squarely on the side of the head. He went down without a sound. The second guard, stunned, fumbled for his pistol. He was too slow. The poker came down again, a brutal, efficient blow. Mabel kicked open the door. Inside, a young woman with wild, dark hair and the fiercest eyes Mabel had ever seen was chained to the wall. Ilara, Tali's mother. She looked up, not with fear, but with a defiant fire. "Who are you?" Ilara demanded. "I'm a friend of your son," Mabel said, pulling a set of bolt cutters from her pack, another gift from her father. "And we are leaving." The escape was a blur of smoke and gunfire. Wikasa, seeing them emerge from the cabin, laid down a hail of covering fire. The marshals, seeing a chance, pushed their attack with renewed ferocity. In the confusion, Mabel, Ilara, and the mule slipped back into the ravine and up the side of the mountain. They didn't stop until they reached the summit again, their lungs burning, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. Below them, the battle raged on, but the tide had turned. The law was winning. Ilara looked at Mabel, her eyes full of questions. "My son," she breathed. "Is he?" "He's safe," Mabel said. "He's waiting for you." And then she looked at Wikasa, who had joined them on the ridge, his rifle hot, his face smeared with soot. He was looking at Ilara, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated relief. But Ilara wasn't looking at him with gratitude. She was looking at him with a strange, intense familiarity. "Wikasa?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He flinched, as if struck. How do you know that name? Alara's eyes filled with tears. My father told me stories, she said, her voice cracking. Before he was killed, about the brave Lakota boy he adopted, the one he raised as his own son, the one who was taken from us. The world stopped spinning. Wicasa stared at her, his mind reeling. Adopted? The Millers? The family he had been accused of murdering? Old man Miller, Alara said, tears streaming down her face. He was my father. You are my brother. The truth, when it finally came, was more shocking than any lie. Wicasa wasn't just an innocent man framed for a crime. He was the lost son of the murdered family. Tali wasn't just his charge, he was his nephew. And Sheriff Brody, in his greedy, murderous rage, hadn't just killed his uncle. He had killed Wicasa's adopted father and tried to kill his entire family. The story was over. The battle was won. Brody and his men were either dead or in chains. Alara was free and on her way to being reunited with her son. Wicasa was not only exonerated, but he was also an heir to the very fortune that had almost cost him his life. Weeks later, the snow had melted, and the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the cold earth. The homestead was quiet. Wicasa, Alara, and the baby Tali had stayed with Mabel, their lives intertwined in a way none of them could have ever predicted. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Wicasa found Mabel on the porch, staring out at the horizon. They're leaving tomorrow, she said, not looking at him. Alara was taking Tali east, to a new life, away from the ghosts of the West. I know, Wicasa said. An awkward silence settled between them. They had fought a war together, but they didn't know how to navigate the peace. You'll be going with them, I suppose, Mabel said, her voice carefully neutral. You're a rich man now. You have a family, a sister. He didn't answer for a long time. He just watched the last sliver of sun dip below the hills. She asked me to, he said finally, to go with them, to help raise Tali. Mabel's heart, which she thought had been repaired, cracked just a little. You should, she said, her voice tight. He's your blood. He is, Wicasa agreed, but blood isn't the only thing that makes a family. He turned to her then, and his eyes were full of a raw, vulnerable emotion she had never seen before. I told her no. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. Why? Because my place is here, he said, his voice soft but sure. I spent my whole life running, from a crime I didn't commit, from a name I didn't want, from a past I couldn't remember. I'm done running. He took a step closer. This place, you're the first home I've ever known. He reached out and took her hand. Her calloused, capable fingers curled around his. A woman who makes a fire feel like a fortress, he whispered, quoting Reuben's letter. He was right. Mabel looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of a deep, abiding joy. The hollow place in her heart, the one left by Ruthie, was still there. It would always be there. But it was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of a new family, forged in secrets, blood, and fire. They didn't find love in the way the stories tell you, with flowery words and easy promises. They built it, out of ash and snow and the shared promise to stand their ground. They had saved each other, and in doing so, they had saved themselves. If this story of unlikely heroes and unbreakable spirit moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of the untamed West. We've got a lot more stories to tell. Now, I have to ask you, at what point in the story did you realize who the real villain was? Let me know in the comments below.